Alrighty, I've been thinking. The Ruskies have been fighting for so long in Donbas, trying to accomplish what was their initial goal, which was just to finalize the borders of the Donbas republics. And after that, the Ruskies got a little more. I think their eyes got a little big for their stomach, and they said, "You know what? No, we're gonna just keep pushing into Ukraine." And it became kind of clear, well, they're going to get as much as they can, and the idea being, the Kiev regime was going to cease to exist, and if there would be a country called Ukraine in the future, the Ruskies were going to determine what the government was. But considering it's been a year now and they're still fighting in Donbass, I think it is or it would be reasonable to reconsider, since the Ruskies don't exactly tell us what their exact plans are, that maybe they're not going to try and push as far as they once made it clear they were going to. There was a time when they were trying to, take Kharkov, or at least I shouldn't say they didn't go into the city, but they surrounded it. That was a while ago. They're pretty far back from there now. They just retook Soledar, and I guess they're getting close with Bakhmut. And just like with every city that the Ukrainians have kind of dug into, we do hear that there are a lot of casualties on the Ukrainian side, and that they just keep pumping in new recruits. The meat grinder in Ukraine is an apt analogy, from what I understand. Now, we don't have finalized numbers. You have politicized numbers coming from both the Ruskies and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians say, oh, well, they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ruskies, and they've lost almost no soldiers themselves, and the Ruskies say the same, but in reverse. But even Western media has been reporting that there's a lot of Ukrainian casualties in Bakhmut, and that it's very costly for them to hang on to it, just like it was with Mariupol. But this has been a slow and rather prolonged military expedition on the part of the Russians, and I think that there's an increasing chance that the Ruskies will lower their expectations and their goals will revert something closer to what they were at the start of the war, which was just reinforcing the Donbass, pushing the Kiev regime out of both Donetsk and Luhansk entirely, and just drawing a line there. And when you think about it, those are not very big territories. It should have been rather easy for the Ruskies to do, and so I can see why the Ruskies' eyes maybe got a little big for their stomachs. But if it's taken them this long and they still haven't consolidated the Donbass, how many years would it take them to bite off an even bigger chunk of Ukraine? I mean, if I were Putin, I would be kind of tired of this by now. And I'm not saying the Russians can't do it. I'm not saying that the Russians are about to, be overthrown themselves. I'm not spouting that nonsense that Ukraine supporters think they're going to be marching to Moscow. That is also absurd. But with the amount of weapons that the West has pumped into Ukraine, they've been able to hold out for a very long time, at, I think, probably a great human cost. But it helps when you don't really have to pay for your own weapons, and your government is also being paid for by all the Western governments collectively. This is a NATO war against Russia. The full force of NATO is behind Russia. The U.S. military is saying that they are low on certain supplies because they've been sending them all to Ukraine. So if Ukraine has burned through Pentagon stockpiles, I don't know what else to call this other than a full-scale NATO war against Russia, just using Ukrainian meat bags. The grunts on the ground don't speak English for the most part, except for these weird volunteers over there. But for the most part, the average soldier over there happens to be from Ukraine. If that weren't the case, everyone would say, oh yeah, this is a full-scale NATO war against them. So the full might, the industrial power, the financial power, the resources of NATO have been put against Russia, and that's been able to hold them off. And so how long does Russia want to keep up a fight against the full force of NATO? And frankly, prior to this war, the Ukrainians were had a better military probably than most NATO countries, and they trained to not what's the term? It's not really NATO spec, but they were as NATO as you could get without actually being a part of NATO. I believe they used NATO tactics, and their officers were trained by NATO. And so the Ruskies, I think, were just expecting to be able to take on Ukraine by itself, in which case, Ukraine, not financially stable, they didn't have great resources, they weren't, particularly well organized. Ukraine by itself would have collapsed rather quickly. But since the Western elite do not show any sign of relenting in their support for Ukraine, I think that the Ruskies could trim their expectations and maybe just settle with Donbas when they. And I know I've been very wordy with this because I keep getting off track and I keep coming to this almost up to this point without actually saying it. I think that maybe after they consolidate Donbas, if I were Putin, I probably would just declare victory. I don't know if he's going to do that, but it's been a very tough fight, and it's gone on too long. I think that when you've got a war that goes into years rather than months, it's no longer really politically beneficial to you. If Putin can now, unfortunately for him, he's already officially annexed those other two oblasts, so I think they'll have to consolidate those as well after Donbas is done. But perhaps they can declare sort of an initial victory, a victory of their initial goal, which was to liberate Donbas, in their words. And I tend to agree. I think the word liberate is probably appropriate, because I don't think that the post Maidan regime has been hospitable towards the people of Donbas. I think that the average person in Donbas has plenty of reason to not want to be a part of Ukraine. And my test for that is always, hey, if I imagine myself, if I was born into one of these towns, it's not, hey, do I like whatever the politics are of these, particular people or whatever. And it's just like with the Palestinians. When I think about the Palestinians, I think if I were born in Gaza, because you don't get to choose where you're born. If I were born in Gaza, what would I want? Would I want Israel to have more power or less power over me? If I were born into Gaza, I would not be a fan of Israel. Just because I'm an American, and Americans typically are sympathetic towards Israel and their cause or whatever, that's based off of, my experiences, the way I grew up, and the fact that I am not feeling the direct consequences of Israeli policy. The same thing is true, when I think about the people in Donbas. Even if, back in 2014, if you had asked me, of course we support Ukraine against Russian aggression, I probably, because back then I didn't know any better. It was very early on in this conflict, and I probably would have just bought whatever the media said on TV. After all, Fox and CNN were saying the same thing. That must mean it's the truth, right? But no, when I think about it, try and be objective, and I put myself in the shoes of someone living in Donbas who's always lived there, and I think about what's going on. I think, well, gee, who would I side with? Would I side with the government that's been bombing me, or would I side with the people who've been trying to push those people out? I don't think it's a very hard decision, Just like if I grew up in Gaza, I don't think it would be a very hard decision to support, Palestinian Islamic Jihad or one of these other groups if they were fighting back against the Israelis, even if, maybe I wouldn't like them in the abstract. No one lives in an abstract world. You have to play with the hand you're dealt. And so if I lived in Donbas, you better be damned right I'd be playing that Putin card. And so I think that Putin will at least declare partial victory. There's going to be they're going to make a big deal out of winning the war in Donbas when they eventually do, as long as it'll take. And I think maybe then the Ruskies will try and de-emphasize the rest of the war if they keep things up. And they will talk more and more about Donbass and not so much about the rest of Ukraine. That is unless, NATO quits dumping in, unlimited amounts of weapons and money into Ukraine. Because without that, I'm pretty damn confident that the Ruskies would win the battle of resources against the Ukrainians. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.